Chapter 6. Aggressive, Not Reckless. Jocko Willink. Viet Ram, MC-1 Area of Operations, northeast of Ramadi, Iraq, 2006. Suddenly, the sound of machine gun fire ripped through the quiet night air as beautiful but deadly red streaks of tracer fire arced across the sky. I wasn't exactly sure what was going on, but I knew that my sniper overwatch team out there in the darkness was in a gunfight. That was about all I knew for sure. I didn't know if they had been spotted by enemy fighters and fired upon. I wasn't sure what size enemy force they were engaged with. I definitely didn't know what support, if any, the SEALs in the Overwatch element needed from me or our assault force, staged and ready to launch. But even without a clear picture of what was happening, I needed to make a call. And my default mindset was aggressive, to take action, to solve problems, and accomplish the mission. With that in mind, I knew what we must do: execute. We were poised and ready to launch on a major clearance operation in a particularly violent insurgent stronghold. Our objective was to clear a village and marketplace in that stronghold, a series of small buildings and market stalls known to U.S. forces as MAV Market. The name derived from a past combat operation nearby when American forces under enemy attack had called for close air support and U.S. warplanes hit several enemy positions with AGM-65 Maverick missiles. For the operation we were about to launch, I was the ground force commander, staged with the assault force of Charlie Platoon SEALs and a dozen Iraqi soldiers at a U.S. Army Combat Outpost, or COP, in a rural agricultural area outside the city. This area was known to U.S. forces as MC-1. Although it shared a border with the northern edge of the city of Ramadi, MC-1 was physically separated by the Euphrates River that ran west to east through the area, demarcating the urban cityscape from a rural farming community. Beyond the river, the landscape opened into irrigated farm fields, levees, palm trees, and canals interspersed with small, scattered groups of houses. It did not look at all like the urban or desert terrain we had come to expect in Iraq. It was more like a scene from a Vietnam War movie. Task Unit Bruiser and other U.S. forces had nicknamed the area Viet Ram, an ode to the place so many of us had grown up hearing about in stories passed down through oral history from the generations of SEALs who had fought in Vietnam and through the Hollywood celluloid depictions in movies we had all watched growing up. Although the Euphrates River separated the urban zone of Ramadi proper and Viet Ram, the violence from the city spilled over and permeated the countryside. The roads contained massive IEDs, large enough to take out armored vehicles, with frequent attacks along the main thoroughfares. Coalition patrols, when crossing fields or open terrain, were a vulnerable target for enemy mortar teams that knew the area well. The U.S. Army's 1st Battalion, 109th Infantry Regiment, or 1st of the 109th, was responsible for the area. They were an outstanding combat unit of experienced, professional, and courageous soldiers. By the time Task Unit Bruiser arrived, the 1st of the 109th had been on the ground for nearly a year fighting in this area. Because of the expansive rural terrain with limited roads, troop concentrations were impossible. A single infantry platoon had to cover several square kilometers of battle space. With so little combat power to affect such a large space, it was difficult to penetrate deep into enemy-held territory. One of Leif's assistant platoon commanders, or AOIC for Assistant Officer in Charge, in Charlie Platoon, had built a solid relationship with the soldiers of the 1st of the 109th Infantry. The AOIC had teamed up with the Army company and platoon leadership that patrolled the area. Together, they made aggressive plans, orchestrating a bold push into the enemy-controlled territory along the river. The AOIC, along with Charlie Platoon's leading petty officer, or LPO, and Sniper Chris Kyle, led their element of SEALs and the Iraqi soldiers they worked with on patrols and sniper overwatch missions deep into the contested areas, frequently receiving heavy enemy contact. On one operation, the AOIC split his element of SEALs and Iraqi troops into two squads. One squad patrolled on foot across a muddy open field when suddenly insurgent fighters hiding in the tree line and nearby buildings opened up on them with machine guns. The patrol dropped to the ground for protection, pinned down by the enemy's effective fire. Once they were sucking mud, face down in a prone position to avoid the hail of bullets, enemy mortar rounds rained down, impacting all around them. Miraculously, the muddy field saved the patrol, as the mortars penetrated deep into the mud before exploding. The ground absorbed the explosions and lethal shrapnel, leaving large holes in the mud, but fortunately, no holes in our teammates or their Iraqi soldiers. The other SEAL squad, which had maintained a covered position from the levee that bordered the field, quickly laid down suppressive fire and beat back the enemy attack. Their solid efforts and plan using cover and move enabled the SEAL squad stranded in the open to move to safety without any casualties. Over time, the series of aggressive operations by the 1st of the 109th Soldiers, Charlie Platoon SEALs, and Iraqi soldiers challenged the insurgents' control over the area. Together, the operations enabled the 1st of the 109th to gain ground and set up a small COP in the midst of Viet Ram, from which a platoon of the 1st to 109th Soldiers lived and worked. From that small outpost, 1st the 109th and the AOIC SEAL element conducted patrols, gathered atmospherics, and acquired intelligence about enemy operations in the area. Eventually, they identified a small enclave of a dozen or so buildings that seemed to be the root of many enemy attacks, Mav Market. With multiple intelligence sources indicating the area was a base of operations for insurgents, the AOIC had brought the intelligence to us, Leif and the rest of Charlie Platoon, and me at the task unit, with the recommendation that we conduct an aggressive operation in the area. We agreed and planned an assault to clear the village, capture any suspected enemy personnel, search the market, and destroy any weapons caches we found. The planning cycle commenced. Mission approval was given from our chain of command, and a few days later, we launched from Camp Ramadi to the 1st of the 109th Infantry's COP in MC1. Wanting to get eyes on the village and the market prior to the assault, we sent a sniper overwatch team, a small number of SEAL snipers, machine gunners, a corpsman, a radio man, and an element leader into the target area prior to the assault. Their job was to spearhead the operation, sneak in clandestinely, observe the target area for suspicious activity, and provide security when the assault element entered the hamlet. This was critical, as the enemy had an effective early warning network in the area. Sympathetic or fearful locals monitored roads and paths going in and out of enemy strongpoints. When coalition forces passed by, the locals passed signals or made radio calls to inform the insurgents we were headed their way. That gave the enemy fighters an opportunity to make a move. Either run and evade, hide their weapons and pretend to be civilians, or rally their troops and attack with IEDs, machine guns, rockets, and mortars. To minimize their exposure for this mission, the Overwatch element rode into the COP with a standard U.S. Army logistics convoy so as to not raise any suspicion, while the rest of us, the assault force that would actually clear the village and market, remained at Camp Ramadi ready to launch. When darkness fell, the Overwatch element quietly patrolled from the COP. They stealthily made their way across flooded fields, through canals, over levees, and through date palm groves until they reached the target area. The Overwatch element observed from a distance for a few minutes and then determined that one of the buildings on the outskirts of the village appeared vacant. The point man pushed a little farther forward, confirmed that there were no signs of any occupants, and then called the rest of the Overwatch element to advance. The team entered the building and cleared it, not dynamically, as a SWAT team might do, but quietly, like cat burglars. Finding nothing, they put their snipers in place and set their machine gunners in security positions. The radio man passed their position to the Tactical Operations Center back at Camp Ramadi. Once the Overwatch was in position, the next phase of the operation commenced. As ground force commander for the operation, I joined Leif and the rest of Charlie Platoon's SEALs, who would be the assault force for the operation, accompanied by our Iraqi soldiers. The AOIC who had inspired the operation was the assault force commander. We mounted up in our vehicles at Camp Ramadi and drove out to the COP in MC-1 from where the Overwatch had launched. Our assault force was about 30 strong, half SEALs and the other half Iraqi soldiers. With the Overwatch element in position, any movement or activity in the village would be observed and passed to the assault force. I anticipated that there might be enemy activity in the area, spurred up when the assault force entered the vicinity and the insurgent early warning network passed the word. Our transit in the Humvees was uneventful. We arrived at the COP, our staging point for the assault. We pulled in and combat parked the vehicles. Humvees were backed into parking spaces to facilitate quick departure, and our team dismounted. I made a quick radio check with the Overwatch position. Charlie 2-6, this is Jocko. Over, I said. Jocko, this is Charlie 2-6. Go, the Overwatch element leader responded. I passed a quick situation report. Assault forces stage at the COP. Any activity when we rolled in? Negative, he responded. Nothing significant. We saw a few locals moving about. Normal pattern of life. About 20 minutes ago, it got very quiet. When you guys rolled in, no change. It seems like the village is bedded down for the night. Roger, I replied. We will let things continue to settle, then we'll launch in a few hours as planned, I told him, indicating that we would stick to our predetermined assault time late in the night. I walked out to the vehicles and passed word to the rest of the team. The assault force dismounted the vehicles and entered the COP building. They took off their gear, sprawled out, and waited. Leif, his AOIC, and I had business to attend to, so we made our way to a small Tactical Operations Center, TOC, that had been set up by the 1st the 109th Soldiers inside their COP. In an age when people usually think a TOC means giant plasma television monitors, coffee makers, and slick modern furniture, this was the other end of the spectrum. This TOC was bare bones. A few maps on the wall, a rack-mounted base station radio unit to communicate with elements in the field, as well as the headquarters back at Camp Ramadi, some dry erase boards with names, people, and plans written out on them, and basic communication procedures. That was it. The AOIC knew the area and the key leaders well and greeted the Army platoon leader and the soldiers in the TOC. Leif and I introduced ourselves to the leadership of the 1st the 109th Infantry Platoon that was occupying the COP. Good evening, I told them as we shook hands. I'm Jocko, the task unit commander. This is Leif, the SEAL platoon commander. Great to meet you guys, the 1st the 109th Platoon commander said. He was a professional soldier, as were his non-commissioned officers and troops manning the COP. Thanks for all the support you've been giving us. We've really had some good impact around here. A month ago, we would have been attacked just trying to get to this spot. Now we live here. Outstanding. You guys have done great work, I said. I'm glad we were able to support you. With that, the platoon commander talked over the map with us, pointing out danger areas, describing the enemy's tactics particular to the area, and outlining a fire support plan should we need help. Leif and I followed up with some pointed questions about the routes in and out of the target village, and then sat down and listened. Our Overwatch element in the target area continued to pass traffic with no significant change. The area had settled down, and there was no remarkable activity in the village. Inside the COP, we listened to the battalion radio net, the channel that every platoon and every company in the 1st the 109th Battalion monitored. In such a hot area, there was always something happening and radio kept us up to date. Reports of enemy movement, friendly units maneuvering to contact, U.S. troops wounded, and sometimes killed. It was a strange experience to hear the muffled gunfire off in the distance and then hear the radio calls of men on the ground in that distant firefight, engulfed in adrenaline, making decisions, passing information, requesting support. Some leaders stayed calm even in bad situations. With others, you could hear the panic in their voices. Listening to hundreds of radio calls like this taught me and the rest of the task unit bruiser leadership that staying calm on the radio was a mandatory trait if you wanted to lead effectively. Then, in the midst of some of the normal radio traffic, we heard a strange radio call from the 1st to the 109th Battalion TOC back in Ramadi. It seemed there was another coalition unit that had not deconflicted and was purportedly conducting an operation in the direct vicinity of the task unit bruiser operation. It was not normal for a unit to be out without intensive coordination. But there was even more puzzling information. The report on the radio said that the unit could possibly be dressed in indigenous clothing. This quickly went from strange to dangerous. Under normal circumstances, in this hostile battle space with multiple U.S. and Iraqi units, which clearly stood out as friendly in their combat gear and weaponry, the hazards from a potential blue-on-blue or friendly fire situation were quite high without extensive deconfliction. But for coalition troops to conduct an operation without identifiable uniforms, when there were U.S. troops in the area who might mistake them for enemy fighters, was completely insane. Identifying friend from foe was already hard enough, given the fact that the Iraqi army dressed in mismatched uniforms, sometimes throwing in elements of civilian clothing. The insurgents sometimes wore a mix of paramilitary gear, mismatched uniforms, and their favorite clothing, tracksuits with a balaclava or keffiyeh covering their faces. During my first deployment to Iraq, my platoon had always worn black balaclavas, not only to protect our identities, but also because they had a psychologically intimidating effect on the enemy. But in Ramadi, no one in Task Unit Bruiser wore balaclavas or anything that covered their faces. A covered face meant terrorist, and no one wanted to be mistaken for a terrorist in this environment. It could result in an American bullet to the head. Among all this radio traffic, a call came from the Overwatch element. "We've got movement," the radio man from the Overwatch element whispered. Leif, his AOIC, and I stood up and moved closer to listen to the radio. 4 to 6 military-aged males moving tactically, the radio man described. "Do you have PID?" I asked. This was a difficult question. PID meant positive identification. I was asking if the element could identify if the people they were seeing were friendly or hostile. "Stand by," the radio man passed. In the SEAL teams, stand by has many meanings based on how it is used and the tone of the voice. It can mean, wait a second, or it can mean, don't move. It can mean, don't push me any further. It can also mean, I don't know, let me find out. Additionally, it can mean, brace for impact, something bad is about to happen. The tone in the radio man's voice was a combination of, I don't know yet, let me find out, and brace for impact, something bad is about to happen. Leif and I looked at each other. I nodded to Leif, and he knew what I was thinking. Then he nodded to his AOIC, and they grabbed their helmets, hustled outside, and assembled the troops, telling them to gear up and load the vehicles. I then passed a statement that the Overwatch commander didn't expect. Do not engage unless you confirm an actual hostile act. There could be friendlies in the area. What? The Overwatch element leader questioned. This was highly unusual. There could be friendlies in the area that have not coordinated with us, and they might be dressed in indigenous clothing, I told him. Seriously? The Overwatch element leader responded, his frustration coming through even clearer than his radio signal. Seriously. Pass the word, I replied solemnly. This was a very bad situation. Combat is, by nature, confusing. It is impossible to know and understand the dynamics of everything that happens on the battlefield. This is classically known as the fog of war. The fog is real. Differing reports, differing opinions, differing perceptions, time lags to receive and process information, weather conditions, darkness, terrain, enemy feints and maneuvers, friendly forces moving and reacting, the chaos and uncertainty add up and paint a picture that is foggy at best. When I ran the training for the West Coast SEAL teams, one of the lessons I regularly taught was that the most important piece of information you could have on the battlefield is the knowledge of where you are. Without that, nothing else matters. The next most important piece of information is where other friendly forces are located. Only then does it matter where the enemy is. Without knowing where one's own unit is, and without knowing where other friendly units are, it is nearly impossible to engage the enemy. In the scenario unfolding, although the Overwatch knew exactly where they were, exactly where the assault force was, and where the other 1st to the 109th Infantry units were located, they weren't sure now if there were other friendly units in the area. Nor in this case would they be able to positively identify them. It wasn't good. Tense minutes passed. The assault force had loaded into the vehicles and stood by waiting for the word. Then, without any other prior warning, gunfire erupted from the area of the Overwatch. Tracers cut through the sky. I did not know what was happening. I wasn't sure who was shooting at whom. I asked for a status from the radio man on the Overwatch team. Nothing. Was the Overwatch engaging insurgents? Could there be a shootout between insurgents and the local townspeople? Was the Overwatch team compromised and under attack? Was the indigenously dressed coalition unit there? Was this a blue-on-blue fratricide happening? I simply could not know. The only thing I knew was what we had planned and rehearsed during the mission planning. If the Overwatch got compromised, the assault force would roll in hard, meaning we would drive vehicles right into the target area. Normally, they would stop several hundred meters away and the assault force would foot patrol in and lock down or set security on the main road that ran through the village. I also knew that if there were insurgents in the village and we gave them too much time, they would either coordinate their defenses and prepare to fight or run away, neither of which would be good for the assault force. So, despite the uncertainty of the situation, I went with the default mode. I got aggressive. I ran out to the vehicles, loaded with SEALs and ready to roll, jumped into the command vehicle, keyed the mic on my radio, and said, "Execute, execute, execute. We are rolling to Route Duster, the main road in the village, and locking it down." The lead navigator gave his command on the radio, "Rolling." The vehicles shifted into gear and started out rapidly down the road toward the village, toward the gunfire, toward the uncertainty. As the assault force rolled in, the shooting continued but tapered off as our vehicles approached. Although there was a lot of uncertainty in the situation, there were some things that were very well known. The assault force knew where the Overwatch was. Leif and his AOIC had gone over that info with everyone. We had also told them that there were possible friendlies in the area, which made everyone nervous and extremely cautious about shooting. After a few short minutes, the assault force arrived on the road in the middle of the village, came to a halt, and set security. The Overwatch had stopped shooting, but was positively marking their position so we knew where they were. "Overwatch, what do you got?" I asked on the radio. "We had PID on armed military-aged males by the river, maneuvering to attack. We engaged," the element leader responded. "Any enemy movement in the village?" I asked. "Negative," he answered. "Roger. Commence assault," I said, staying in our default aggressive mode. With that, the assault force dismounted, set a cordon on the village, and began a systematic clearance building by building, and then through Mav Market, stall by stall. Although the enemy had clearly been alerted, they had not had time to react. As the assault force cleared the village and the marketplace, they found and detained a number of suspected insurgents who were still dazed from sleep when they were captured. We also discovered a cache of enemy weapons that we destroyed. Despite the confusion and uncertainty during the operation, decisiveness and aggressive action won. We expected our SEALs to operate with an aggressive mindset. We expected them to lean forward, maneuver quickly, see opportunities, and capitalize on them, to aggressively execute, to solve problems, overcome obstacles, accomplish the mission, and win. But of course, there is a dichotomy with being aggressive that must be balanced. Aggression is not always the answer. Aggression must be balanced with logic and detailed analysis of risk versus reward. In Ramadi, Task Unit Bruiser was honored to support the 5,600 U.S. troops, soldiers, Marines, sailors, and airmen of the U.S. Army's Ready 1st Brigade Combat Team of the 1st Armored Division in their efforts to implement the seize, clear, hold, build strategy and take back the city of Ramadi from insurgents. We formed an exceptional working relationship with the Army and Marine leaders and the men in the platoons, companies, and battalions they commanded. Our relationships were based on trust and mutual respect. The Ready 1st Brigade commander, a U.S. Army colonel, was an extraordinary leader, aggressive, smart, and with amazing strategic vision. He was a true professional and one of the finest leaders with whom I ever had the honor to serve. When the brigade commander asked for support, Task Unit Bruiser delivered. We were proud to send in our SEALs and Iraqi soldiers as the lead element of troops on the ground for almost every major combat operation of the seize, clear, hold, build strategy to emplace U.S. combat outposts in the most dangerous, volatile neighborhoods of the city. Several months into the deployment, at one of the brigade operation meetings on Camp Ramadi I attended, the brigade commander asked me if our SEALs could help eliminate the threat of enemy mortar teams in an area north of the city called Sea Lake. The name derived from the area's primary feature, an oxbow lake formed from the Euphrates River that was shaped like a sea. It was a relatively rural area that covered about 10 square miles with open fields along the river, scattered clusters of houses, and small, unpaved country roads. But it was also an area utilized by insurgents to launch mortar attacks on U.S. positions. Almost every day, insurgents lobbed mortars at U.S. troops stationed on Camp Ramadi and other nearby bases. Mortars hit our camp on Shark Base as well, though less frequently. American radar technology could track the mortar's trajectory and deduce the point of origin from where they were launched. Many of the mortars that hit Camp Ramadi came from the Sea Lake area. Unfortunately, the enemy understood that we could identify the point of origin of their mortars, so they had modified their tactics. Instead of firing the mortars from one specific location, they constantly moved around the entire area. Furthermore, when the insurgents fired mortars, they rapidly fired only 1, 2, or 3 rounds at a time in a matter of seconds, then quickly packed up the mortar tube and disappeared. It was an effective tactic that was difficult to counter. On top of the mortar attacks, the insurgents were active throughout the Sea Lake area in placing large IEDs in the roads. There were limited roads in the area, which channelized access for U.S. convoys into a small number of routes that the insurgents could target. With the open terrain around the roads, enemy fighters could observe U.S. Humvees from long distances and detonate the roadside bombs via radio control from unseen locations hundreds of meters away. The IEDs in Sea Lake had taken a deadly toll in recent weeks, with multiple Humvees destroyed and several U.S. Army soldiers killed. Since Task Unit Bruiser had been successful in eliminating enemy mortar teams and IED emplacers in other areas of Ramadi, it seemed logical we could help in Sea Lake. When the brigade commander asked if we could help out in the area, I told him I would take a look and determine how we could best support the mission. I certainly wanted to help the Ready 1st Brigade handle the situation, eliminate threats, and ensure more U.S. troops went home to their families. We also wanted to kill enemy fighters responsible for the attacks and make them pay for the deaths of our brother soldiers who had been killed in the IED attacks. I brought back the request to Leif and Charlie Platoon, and we talked through it. Leif, his platoon chief Tony, and the rest of Charlie Platoon were always eager to close with and destroy the enemy. So they started analyzing the intelligence, looking at maps of the area, and talking with the soldiers who had operated around Sea Lake. They examined, with the rest of Charlie Platoon and the Task Unit Bruiser Intelligence Department, the best possible courses of action to accomplish the mission. Over the next several days, Charlie Platoon launched on other operations in different areas of the city. But upon their return to base, they resumed mission planning for the Sea Lake operation. Then, after several days of careful analysis, Leif came to my office to discuss the results of their analysis. "I don't know about this one, Jocko," he said with a somewhat disappointed look on his face. "What don't you know?" I asked him. "The Sea Lake operation is a tough one," he replied. "I'm not sure it makes sense." "Okay, talk me through it," I said. At this point, Leif and I walked over to a detailed map of Sea Lake hanging on the wall. First, we marked down the known points of origin from where all the mortar attacks had been launched. No two mortar attacks had come from the same location. Second, there was no discernible pattern to the locations. Finally, there weren't any common traits in the terrain from which the mortars had been fired. Some had been fired from roads, some from fields, some from the vicinity of houses or buildings, some in the open, some in areas with foliage for camouflage, some in areas with no camouflage at all. There was no pattern whatsoever that would enable us to position our sniper teams in the right location to observe and engage the enemy mortar teams. Next, Leif pointed out where the IED strikes had taken place. Because the area was bordered by the Euphrates River and crisscrossed with canals, the means to reach the area by vehicle was limited, with only one major road as our access in and out of the area. With the wide open and sparse terrain, there were no good vantage points from which we could set up our sniper overwatch positions that would allow us a long access look down the main road to observe and engage IED emplacers. To do that, we would have to expose ourselves out in the open, giving away our position and opening us up for enemy attack. When we were attacked, if we needed help, the only route that U.S. vehicles could utilize to get to us was this main road where the threat of IED attack was extremely high. It would put the U.S. Army units responding to help us at serious risk. In fact, the Quick Reaction Force might not be able to get to us at all. Of course, the same IEDs would also put our SEALs and Iraqi soldiers riding in the vehicles on the transit in and out of the area at serious risk as well. The bottom line is this, Leif concluded. Any counter-mortar and counter-IED operations in the area of Sea Lake will have a very low probability of success. But the threat to our SEALs and Iraqi soldiers conducting the operation and the U.S. Army troops supporting us will be extremely high. It was clear Leif, Tony, and the rest of his Charlie Platoon leaders had done their homework on this. I certainly knew they weren't risk-averse, as they had proven time and again in the months we'd been in Ramadi. I knew they were eager to put as many enemy insurgent fighters in the dirt as they possibly could in order to protect the brave American soldiers and Marines from deadly enemy attacks. But I understood from their analysis that there was absolutely no way to predict where an enemy attack would come from, which meant we would be setting up an overwatch in a completely random position, basically searching for a needle in a haystack. Even if we knew where to set up, with so few areas to provide good cover and concealment, the enemy wouldn't have a hard time finding us. Finally, with no ability to overwatch the full length of the main road, we wouldn't even be able to fully prevent IEDs from being planted. With all that stacked against us, Leif continued, as much as we'd love to support the brigade commander's request, I'm just not sure this makes sense. The risk isn't worth the reward. He was right. As much as we wanted to execute the operation, take the fight to the enemy, and kill the enemy mortar and IED teams in Sea Lake, the operation didn't make sense. Yep, you're right, I agreed. High risk to us and our support, with a low probability of reward. I'll talk to the brigade commander. I held the highest respect and admiration for the brigade commander. He and his staff put tremendous faith and trust in us and appreciated the risks we took continuously to cover his soldiers and Marines from the high ground with our sniper overwatch positions. I also recognized that in this case, he was overestimating our capability to eliminate the mortar and IED attacks in Sea Lake. That night, I drove across base and explained the situation to the brigade commander. He completely understood, and we discussed some alternative strategies to solve the problem, like using some persistent air coverage or establishing a permanent coalition presence in the area, a series of checkpoints or combat outposts that could keep things under control. The brigade commander knew, as I did, that while being aggressive is a great default attitude to have, it still must be balanced with caution and careful consideration to ensure it is not a case of excessive risk with limited reward. Principle. Problems aren't going to solve themselves. A leader must get aggressive and take action to solve them and implement a solution. Being too passive and waiting for a solution to appear often enables a problem to escalate and get out of control. The enemy isn't going to back off. The leader must get aggressive and put the enemy in check. The good deal isn't going to deliver itself to a company. The leader has to go out and make a good deal happen. Changes and new methodologies in a team aren't going to implement themselves. Leaders need to aggressively implement them. An aggressive mindset should be the default setting of any leader. Default aggressive. This means that the best leaders, the best teams, don't wait to act. Instead, understanding the strategic vision or commander's intent, they aggressively execute to overcome obstacles, capitalize on immediate opportunities, accomplish the mission, and win. Rather than passively waiting to be told what to do, default aggressive leaders proactively seek out ways to further the strategic mission. They understand the commander's intent, and where they have the authority to do so, they execute. For decisions that are beyond their pay grade or above their authority, default aggressive leaders still make a recommendation up the chain of command to solve problems and execute key tasks to achieve strategic victory. In SEAL platoons and task units, we expect this from leaders at every level, right down to the frontline trooper in charge of just himself and his small piece of the mission. But this mentality is crucial to any leader in any team or organization. It is just as critical to success in business as on the battlefield. Aggressive means proactive. It doesn't mean that leaders can get angry, lose their temper, or be aggressive toward their people. A leader must always deal professionally with subordinates on the team, peers, leaders up the chain of command, customers or clients, and personnel in supporting roles outside the immediate team. Speaking angrily to others is ineffective. Losing your temper is a sign of weakness. The aggression that wins on the battlefield, in business, or in life is not directed toward people, but toward solving problems, achieving goals, and accomplishing the mission. It is also critical to balance aggression with careful thought and analysis to make sure that risks have been assessed and mitigated. The dichotomy with the default aggressive mindset is that sometimes hesitation allows a leader to further understand a situation so that he or she can react properly to it. Rather than immediately respond to enemy fire, sometimes the prudent decision is to wait and see how it develops. Is this a simple reconnaissance by fire? Is it a feint by the enemy meant to distract from the real attack? Is the enemy simply trying to lure you into a confined area where they have a superior force waiting to ambush? A careful moment of consideration might reveal the enemy's true intentions. To be overly aggressive without critical thinking is to be reckless. That can lead the team into disaster and put the greater mission in peril. To disregard prudent counsel when someone with experience urges caution, to dismiss significant threats, or to fail to plan for likely contingencies is foolhardy. It is bad leadership. A chief contributing factor to recklessness comes from what military historians have long referred to as the disease of victory. This disease takes place when a few battlefield successes produce an overconfidence in a team's own tactical prowess while underestimating the capabilities of its enemy or competitor. This is a problem not just for combat leaders, but for leaders and teams anywhere, in any arena, throughout the business world and the civilian sector. It is a leader's duty to fight against this victory disease so that the team, despite its success, never gets complacent. The risk in any action must be carefully weighed against the potential rewards of mission success. And of course, to counter that thought, the cost of inaction must be weighed as well. As aggressive as leaders must be cautious that they are not running to their deaths simply because their instinct is to take action. The dichotomy between aggression and caution must be balanced. So be aggressive, but never reckless. Application to business. I am going to build the team now so we are ready to handle the growth that will come in the next 18 to 24 months, the CEO told me with great enthusiasm. She was the owner of a small business set for rapid expansion. The CEO had bought the business from the former owner, who had kept it on cruise control for the past 5 years as he eased into retirement. Since taking over the business, the new CEO had been getting aggressive and getting customers. She was working hard and driving her team to do the same. The company was poised for some really big growth in the next couple of years. She knew she needed help with that growth and had brought in Echelon Front to coach her and provide leadership training for her team. It certainly seemed she and her company were on the right track. However, there were tough obstacles in the CEO's path. First, she had spent most of her personal capital to purchase the company from the previous owner, who had left the business with little cash flow. So between her personal finances and the company's weak balance sheet, there wasn't much operating capital. Traditional business problems were also present. As with most sales scenarios, this custom manufacturing business had many sales leads that needed follow-up, and only a small percentage of those converted into actual sales. The business had a particularly long turn time from orders placed until payment was received. This included designing, testing, approval, and manufacturing, all of which included transport lag times to and from Asia, where the manufacturing took place. That meant very long and capital-intensive delays between when deals were signed and when final payments were made by the clients. The CEO continued rattling off her plan to me. I can see where we're headed right now. The number of leads we are getting, the referrals are increasing, the closing rate for the team is going up. We are going to explode next year, and I want the team to be more than ready. Default aggressive, right? She asked me, referring to the combat leadership principle I had discussed with her and her team a few days before. Absolutely, I replied. Default aggressive. I liked that attitude and always had. That afternoon, she explained the plan to me in more detail. The positions she was duplicating, new positions she was creating, and how she was going to structure the company. It was impressive. She had a great vision of where the company was going and the immense capacity it was going to have to execute orders and deliver results on par with some of her biggest competitors. In order to house the expanding team, she was looking at new locations for the business, or, at a minimum, expanding her current location to include one of the adjacent spaces. However, she was leaning toward moving to a new location, more professional in appearance. The company's current location was run down from years of declining business, and the building didn't come across as a first-class operation. The CEO knew the value of first impressions and was determined to change that. The new location has potential for even more growth, she explained, which I know we are going to need. Hearing this aggressive mindset was like music to my ears, and the CEO's dynamic and enthusiastic attitude had me completely on board. Outstanding, I told her, and then I doubled down on this attitude. If you set up the right groundwork, infrastructure, and put the right people in place now, you will be ready to take over the world next year. At that point, filled with fervor and moxie, we literally high-fived each other like a couple of high school kids who had just won the state basketball championship. What a great way to end the meeting. I walked out of the building that day, looking forward to our next meeting the following week. But as I drove to the airport for the flight home, I sobered up from the excitement and realized I was actually pretty emotional about the company. Good emotion, but too much emotion. I realized I was caught up in the owner's enthusiasm and relishing her aggressive mindset. For that very reason, for the CEO's long-term good and the good of the company, I needed to check myself. When I got home that night, I sent her an email thanking her for the great meeting. I praised her attitude, but then tapered those thoughts. I told her that before she moved forward with any big decisions, we should do a serious and unemotional analysis of the financials, a conservative view of operating capital and growth potential, and forecast how the company's overhead would increase in the near and long term. I asked her to have her team put together these numbers for our meeting next week so we could discuss them. When I met with her the following week, she was still enthusiastic, which was great to see. But I had to keep myself in check. I had to make sure I didn't get caught up in the enthusiasm and attitude of aggressiveness. I had to ensure that she wasn't being overly aggressive, even reckless. I think we are still good to move forward, the CEO said, leading me into her office, where her Chief Financial Officer, CFO, and Human Resources Director were waiting. Great, I replied. Let's look at the numbers. The CFO presented a few slides explaining the company's financial outlook. When it came to the bottom line, it was tight. Too tight for me to feel comfortable, but perhaps doable. Then I noticed one word on the predictive sales chart. Stretch. I see you have stretch written there. Are these your stretch goals? I asked the CEO. She stumbled a bit, then confirmed. Well, they are, kind of, but as we expand our sales force, we should be able to hit them. You mean a sales force that you haven't hired, haven't tested, haven't trained, and who haven't been proven yet? I asked, growing concerned. Well, not yet, she replied, fading off. We both know that none of those are easy with salespeople, I said. Not the hiring, not the training, and certainly not the proving. New salespeople are hit and miss in every industry. And if you are looking at accomplishing your stretch goals based on a stretch sales force, you might have some major issues. Well, if it takes a little longer to get there, we can just take a little longer, the CEO pushed back. We have time. Are you sure? I asked. Bring up the budget again, will you? I said to the CFO. He put the budget slides up on the screen. I took a look in greater detail this time. Your stretch goals barely cover your overhead. And as overhead goes up, it won't get any better, I observed. But we need to be positioned to dominate next year, the CEO stated, subconsciously appealing to my affinity for being aggressively prepared. I had to check myself and her. I get that, I responded. But look, without achieving stretch goals, in 6 months, you won't break even. As you are sitting waiting for payments to come through, you'll have burned through your operating capital. Now, you could go get a loan or look for investors, but that is a short-term sacrifice for which you'll never stop paying. And if the trend continues without any external money, in a year, you'll be upside down. In 18 months, you could easily be in a position vulnerable to some really bad investor deals or a forced buyout or even worse, bankruptcy. But what if I do make the goals and then we aren't ready? The CEO asked. I thought I needed to be aggressive. Well, you do need to be ready and you do need to be aggressive, but being aggressive doesn't mean throwing caution to the wind. It doesn't mean taking catastrophic risk that can and should be mitigated. And it doesn't mean relying on unrealistic stretch goals. You need to get aggressive with risk mitigation and with securing long-term success for your company. You need to get aggressive with maintaining full control and ownership of the company. You need to get aggressive with budgeting and contingency planning. That's what you need to get aggressive with. Otherwise, you're putting yourself, your hard work, your team, and your company at risk. The CEO nodded, beginning to understand where I was coming from. Look, I continued, you know how when I explained default aggressive to your leadership team the other day, I explained in detail that I didn't mean getting aggressive toward your people? And how screaming and shouting as a leader wasn't the kind of aggression that helps you lead? Of course, there are times when you have to be firm with people, but it has to be balanced. Aggression is a great attribute, but it can spin out of control. This is a similar situation. Getting aggressive here and growing your overhead isn't going to help you or the company. It's just going to leave you exposed and vulnerable to risk. So let's reset. Take a look at the end state you are trying to achieve and come up with a measured, balanced way to get there. Then create a plan that has some embedded checkpoints, triggers, and branch plans so that the risks you take are controlled, calculated, and also provide some exit strategies in case things don't go the way you expect them to. The CEO nodded and smiled. I guess I just like being aggressive a little too much. But yes, this makes sense. There's definitely a way to get this done with less risk and more control. With that, we went to work. We formulated a plan that slowly increased infrastructure and support as the sales team not only grew, but proved itself with actual deals closed. The office move was pulled out of the plan, and even the expansion of the existing office was put off until the current space was truly overflowing. She also decided to cut some other expenses. She downsized the warehouse for storing product that wasn't being used to capacity and decided to eliminate one of the 3 account managers who hadn't built much business yet. When she briefed me on the changes to the plan, I smiled. I like it, I told her. I do too, the CEO admitted, and it is a good way to be aggressive. Instead of getting aggressive in preparing for an unknown future, I got aggressive cutting costs and managing my P&L. And you know what? She asked me. What's that? I asked. It still felt good, she replied, happy she was able to direct her aggressive mindset to lead her company by focusing that attitude in the right direction and balancing aggression with clear, unemotional thought and sensible risk mitigation.